Well, we do want to give a special welcome to our speaker today for his, as I say, heroic journey over from Oxford by many different bits and pieces along the way. It sounds like accepting camels and donkeys, but I think everything else, in fact, he'll tell us about this journey. Dr. Chapman lectures in the history of science in the Faculty of Modern History at Oxford. He's lectured and written very widely on biographical material in the history of science and also particularly in astronomy. And today he's going to speak to us on historical perspectives on Christianity and mental illness. I have mentioned to Dr. Chapman that some may have to leave. We understand if you have to leave at 2 o'clock and slip out, and that will be well understood that we've started very late. But Dr. Chapman will speak for 45 minutes and we'll have some time for questions, answers for those who can stay. So over to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here, and I mean literally an enormous pleasure to be here. As opposed to being trains, waiting around on stations and all the rest of it. I was hoping to catch the 9:05 train in this morning into Oxford. It was cancelled, the one after it was cancelled. Although there's no snow, there's no more snow in Oxford than there is here. A little bit more on the way, but nothing disruptive. But what one man on the station at Oxford said to me, I asked what's going on. She was a railway employee. He said, incompetence. So there we are. I want to say something today about Christian medical and ideas about the mind, mental illness, and of course what they called for centuries madness, or managing the mad. I'm going to be talking of a wide sweep. I am a historian, of course, I should be therefore speaking in a historical context, and asking certain kinds of questions, such as why is it, let's say, until the 17th and 18th centuries, that one finds a particular strong interest in improving the way in which the mad, the generic term, the mad, are actually cared for in a Christian society. And so to look at some of these wider issues. But one of the remarkable things which has always struck me, when you look at the way in which the Christian faith moved from basically the villages of Capernaum and Galilee into the Latinate Grecian world of the first century, the speed was quite remarkable. I would, of course, I'm sure, like many other people, love to know what sort of training St. Luke had. Luke, the beloved physician. Had he read Hippocrates? Had he read Dioscorides? Was he a folk healer? We just love to know. He wrote good Greek. He, after all, wrote a gospel and wrote the Acts of the Apostles. So you would suspect, therefore, at least an educated man, a considerably educated man. But we love to know more. When you look, of course, at medicine, all forms of medicine in the Gospels themselves, they're always miraculous. And, of course, this is for the straightforward reason that Christ does not come into the world as a Galilean National Health Service, but as a giver of signs and wonders to the incarnation and God on earth. So in a way, one has to look at, of course, what Christ is doing there as a preparatory for his greater mission. You might almost call it, on a simple level, a crowd draw. Now, when you start to find in the immediate post-resurrection period, and let's say the post-Pauline period, let's say the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s AD, the speed with which the Christian faith assimilates into the Greco-Roman world and rapidly borrows many of its institutions. The simpler the way you organized yourself. The fact, of course, that when Judas commits suicide and is lost to the apostles, what do? They actually do a very classical Roman thing. They elect another. They don't just appoint one, they elect another to succeed him. And by the first century, you're beginning to find references and numerous comments about the Christian church working within the structures and the broader institutional procedures of the Greco-Roman world. This, I think, must inevitably have absorbed medical concepts as well, along with broadly political, organizational ones, medical concepts also. And I think it's quite remarkable that the faith which, of course, starts, like I say, in the villages of Galilee in the 20s AD, within 100 years has actually permeated a substantial part of the Mediterranean world, and of course by the 300s AD has actually won its first Roman emperor. So that in itself, I think, is one context in which to see the development of medicine. If you therefore look at medicine in the Gospels in all of its forms, it's essentially the driving out of a devil, the classical one of course, or the classic one of course, being the lunatic of the Gadarenes, who literally has devils driven out of him into a herd of swine. Yet by the time you're getting into the classical world, there's a very different approach to what mental illness is. There, it can be two things. It can either be a pagan idea of possession by the gods, by Hecate, or by Jupiter, or by a variety of spirits. Or it can be in the Hippocratic tradition, the idea of somehow the mind having a physical basis which relates to behavioural patterns. And this absorbs remarkably quickly. One finds it certainly in medieval Christian literature about the mind, the brain, and how they were thought to work. The development of the three-chambered theory of the brain, developed by medieval anatomists out of Galen and out of the classical world, and very significantly, when Marjorie Kemp is brought up before a variety of ecclesiastical courts in or around 1400 and shortly after their work, one finds an extraordinary approach by bishops, physicians, city bailiffs, particularly Lincoln, Leicester and York, who actually dealt with Marjorie, about explaining what was actually wrong with her. Because they're clearly working, by the time that you get to certainly 1400, of there being, on the one hand, a real form of possession, a demonic possession, which fits very, very closely to what Marjorie herself thought she had, probably in the wake of her, or one of her 14 children, which gave her a strong sense to commit suicide, kill herself, and basically erase herself. And then after that, of course, the seeing of the vision of Christ on her bed, where her behaviour changed. Yes, of course, for the rest of her life, she is a visionary. She is a shouter in church. She is a proclaimer of the wickedness of the world, what gets, of course, hauled up before the ecclesiastical courts. But on the other hand, here they're recognising that there's genuine spiritual experience. It may be the devil that originally triggered some aspects of her behaviour, but it's Christ who gave her visionary experience. But they also recognise another thing in Marjorie, and that is that there is, in their world and in their culture, such a thing as clinical madness. So you're having medieval bishops, senior individuals in the church, recognising, asking, is this woman spiritually empowered, or whatever you want to call it, or is she suffering from what you might broadly call a clinical syndrome? It's very clear that that is recognised in both cases. The course of her career as a visionary convinces everybody that she is a real visionary. But it's fascinating to bear in mind that people like the Archbishop of York and also to the Abbot of Leicester are talking quite possibly about madness as well as genuine possession, the spiritual possession. What I'm really saying here, therefore, is that by the time that you get to 15th century Europe, there is an acceptance that there is a genuine visionary state, that there can also be a demonic possessional state, and that there can also be clinical madness caused by a variety of forms. A rather more sophisticated view of the Middle Ages than certain people like to generally think of. What would they have thought was the nature of a clinical madness in the 14th century, or in, for that matter, the 4th century, or back to Hippocrates in the 4th century BC? The variety of ideas on offer, generally all of them about balance. And I think this is one reason why a spiritual understanding of mental illness in all of its forms is a nobler one than a reductionist. Generally speaking, whether you're dealing with Galen, or whether you're dealing with Hippocrates, or you're dealing with Celsus in the 1st century BC, Roman physician, a medical writer, you're dealing with the idea that somehow the brain is, or that the body, the spirit, brain relationship is designed by God, or in the pagan world, the gods, to be in balance. It's a functional system. It's expected to be like your heart or your stomach or something like that. And when you find a person who is aberrantly behaving, this must indicate that some form of balance has been destroyed or changed. In the more sophisticated form developed by Galen in the 2nd century AD, this balance is seen as rooted in the 4 humours: yellow bile, black bile, blood and phlegm. And both Aristotle and also Galen share the idea that black bile has something to do with emotional, mental states. Yes, blood does as well. Blood can make you jolly and happy. Phlegm can make you inclined to certain respiratory problems and things of this sort, but black bile is usually the culprit of the, traditionally the scholar's disease. And in my recent work on Thomas Harriot in the 17th century, when Thomas Harriot, the English mathematician, was examined by Sir Theodore Mayerne in 1615, Mayerne, of course, one of the leading physicians in Europe of his day, when Harriot had a rather troublesome little growth in his nose, which turned out to be nasal cancer and eventually killed him. What does Mayerne call him in his notes? He was a melancholic. Mr. Harriot was a melancholic. He was a mathematician and a scholar, and hence inclined to melancholy, the sad disease traditionally associated with scholars. So this is where I would argue what is coming from in a rapid overall view, getting to, let's say, the late medieval and Renaissance period. Then, one figure I want to look at particularly, and the man I've done quite a lot of work on, and I find him immensely fascinating, is Thomas Willis. I'm going to be talking about two Willises today, both of them totally unrelated to each other genetically and living 100 years apart. Thomas in the 17th century and Francis in the 18th, but I'll be coming to Francis anon. Thomas Willis is one of the first people to seriously try to connect human behaviour and emotional states to lesions in the brain. He's by no means the first person to try to think of this idea. You have it going back into the three lobes theory of medieval physiology and so on. But what he does is dissect and dissect with a vengeance. Now, I often wonder when reading the case books and things of this sort of Willis, who is active in Oxford in a serious way, 1655 to, well, 1668 when he goes to reside in London, and 4 years after that until he dies at the age of 56, I think it is. But one of the things you find when you look at Willis is the sheer number of human dissections he performed. He becomes concerned with the brain and the mind through what might strike most of us as a singularly bizarre coincidence: the death of his first wife. And this was the lady who was the former daughter, or the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, Samuel Fell. This was Miss Mary Fell, or Miss Mary Fell as she'd been. She died, and he seems to have been seriously distraught at this condition. And he says, for consolation, I took myself to the opening of heads, which is not what most grieving widowers would generally do, to take myself to the opening of heads. I think I can identify a couple of the locations in Oxford where he did this. One of them behind his house, which is Beam Hall, near to Merton College, and another one too at a place now covered by the Oxford University Examination Schools, which he actually took a lease on as a sort of private hospital teaching place. But let me give you an idea of the background which brings Willis to this. Like so many men, and like another category of individuals I'm going to be talking about in a few moments, he doesn't set out to be a doctor. Medical practice in England, or in Europe for that matter, was nowhere near as hard and fast, clinically and qualification-wise, as it would become in the 19th century. He is a young man born in 1621, goes up as a servitor, a poor scholar, to Christ Church, becomes deeply involved with the Church of England. He considers seriously becoming a priest, but of course what intervenes is the Civil War. The Civil War, he hated Puritanism with a vengeance. He was a staunch Laudian, a staunch High Churchman, and actually lost his job in Christ Church, or lost his short-term studentship in Christ Church, largely because he would not swear an oath against the Church of England, or at least against the king, against the then living King Charles, in favour of the Parliament. This gives him what you might call a sudden career option. He can't become a vicar anymore, so therefore he has to earn his living. Well, he obviously liked living and dead things. He swots up on a bit of medicine. He finally gets round to taking a BM and later a DM in Oxford, but he's already physicking folk before that. He tells us that he used to take his horse on Wednesdays to Abingdon Market, and there effectively tout for business in the market. And this was a way in which you started your medical career in those days. He's good at it. And he's fascinated by all kinds of connections in human behaviour. Probably it's in his case books that we have a classic description of what, of course, we would now call bipolar disorder, of what he refers to as a woman of Eton. Eton, of course, being a village about 3 miles outside Oxford, whom he'd probably met on his travels, a local gentlewoman. He says that her behaviour seemed to lurch between what we would now call hyperactivity and a sort of despairing inability to move. And he came to explain this as a movement of liquids in the brain. And it's part of a whole pathology, not invented by Willis, but largely developed by him in a serious form, where the four lobes of the brain, the lateral ventricles of the brain, contain what they called, or what they thought was animal spirits, cerebrospinal fluid, and the way in which they moved and discharged into each other was thought to be related to behavioural patterns. It's fascinating too that it's an alternative to melancholy. It's liquids in the brain that are moving. Willis develops this idea very, very strongly. He then, following the death of his wife, takes himself to the opening of heads. He is now actually jobless in the university. He's been effectively removed from Christchurch, and there devotes himself to chemistry, medicine, and basically taking patients without a license. But that doesn't matter too much, as I will be saying in a few minutes. He was obviously very good at practicing medicine as it was then understood. He clearly had the capacity to make people feel, as it were, comfortable under his care, what I suppose you would call a good bedside manner. And like a lot of doctors of the day, who of course could cure very, very, very few diseases, probably knew the ability of actually making a person feel spiritually and physically at ease, and recognizing that this had a lot to do with the general well-being of the person. He gets good at it. He starts writing medical treatises on urines in 1659, assisted, of course, by Robert Hooke, at that time working as his, effectively, dissector chemical assistant in Oxford. And then, following the death of Mary, his wife, he starts to dissect heads with serious vengeance. And he mentions in Cerebri Anatomi, 1664, the first book to coin the term neurologia, the first invention of the word neurology. He mentions dissecting a man who, in dissection, was found to have a completely atrophied left carotid, and a right carotid that had swollen to 3 times the normal size. That man, he discovers, in life had suffered no behavioural, mental or emotional problems. He died from something totally separate. That was puzzling why. He should have been dead on half of his brain. In the classical pathology of the day, each carotid fed each side of the brain. Your left carotid is gone, you should be losing your left lobe. Of course, this was not the situation. He then goes on to make one of the most important single clinical discoveries in this research into the brain. He finds that the brain is irrigated with blood from a great circular artery into which both of the carotids pump, and then a series of branching arteries feed each of the lobes. So even if you lose a carotid, the circle of Willis, as it comes to be immortalised as, will feed both sides. Now, this gives you an idea of where he's looking at. He's looking at how we behave, why you can actually have serious arterial problems, and therefore so this is the immediate period after Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood, and yet normality of mental behaviour. He also does another classic dissection, which, how he got away with this, I can't understand, because it was published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1666 about a young man who was a gentleman commoner of Wadham, and I'm sure his dad must have heard about it, and that his son had been dissected by Dr. Willis. This is another problem about how the brain works. In fact, a man called Samuel Mashbourne, a 17-year-old undergraduate, in an uncommonly warm heat wave of May 1666, was out with a group of friends at Medley, just down the river Charwell, and a violent storm comes on, and he's struck by lightning and killed what was called stone dead. It was found that young Mashbourne had about the size of a half crown, a brown mark below his right ear. No other markings on the body, apart from a bit of burning down the chest. We now recognise, of course, probably that he was wearing metal waistcoat buttons. He's brought back to Wadham. He's to be buried in the chapel, or at least the burial ground between the chapel and the hall, which was the normal place in those days. And somehow Willis borrows the body. I suspect a porter's hand was crossed with half a crown or something of this sort. He was taken out of the town into some kind of barn, we're not told the exact location, where a large concourse of Oxford medical men were there. So many of them there, in fact, that the operator who was opening up Mashbourne's skull to take the brain out couldn't even find he had enough elbow room to saw. This is mentioned. But what they find is when they dissect Mashbourne, his internal organs are totally and absolutely perfect, apart from a little bit of bruising on the skin where the bolt went in, and they ask why. What is it that knocks the life out of a healthy 17-year-old like that and doesn't leave any internal damage? Now that's the kind of question Willis is asking. Effectively, he thought his soul had been knocked out of his body. Willis, of course, is a devout Christian, who, of course, in 1660 is given all the rewards of glory. He is, of course, given a new chair in Oxford, he's restored to his studentship in Christchurch, and all the rest of it, and of course he's now a distinguished, very, very eminent figure. But he's asking the question, how is the soul locked into the body? Of course, he knows Descartes. How does the soul get knocked out? And what is the relationship between the obvious functioning physiology of the brain and its lesions and its connections to the central nervous system and the processes of cognition? The processes of cognition which can either be healthy or disturbed in the form of mental illness, madness, mania, delusion, or something like that. And it's fascinating that actually he's asking these kind of questions. Now, Willis's works on the brain and on the mind are, I think, seminal. He is the first person to seriously bring up this whole set of questions with a massive body of dissection evidence behind it. He was also, too, a hands-on dissector. He taught his own students to dissect. And, of course, too, the young Christopher Wren, in the days before he is knighted, before he becomes an architect, acts as his draftsman. So, therefore, you have the wonderful plates in the cerebrine with Christopher Wren's drawings to illustrate them. And, of course, Wren clearly was interested in anatomy himself. Now, what is remarkable is that that book, that immensely influential work, Cerebri Anatomi, is dedicated to Gilbert Sheldon. Gilbert Sheldon was to become, shortly after the Restoration, Archbishop of Canterbury. Willis became the Archbishop's personal friend, his doctor, and a person with whom he had extensive theological conversations. He asks what is the brain and its relationship to wider processes. He uses a wonderful phrase for the brain. It is the living, breathing temple of the deity. That's the place where somehow God connects with how the body works. He doesn't, like Descartes, put forth any theories about this happening, but he is willing to accept the idea that we have an immortal soul. It is somehow bonded to the cortex and to the body, and even when we have some kind of thing going wrong in the body, such as maybe fluids moving the wrong way, it can produce aberrant behaviour. Willis, therefore, is colossally influential. And I think, therefore, it's important to bear in mind that with him, the scientific study of behavioural pattern related to neurology comes in. And, of course, too, he sees the whole thing as intimately connected to a Christian context. Now, this leads me on to another area where I've come to increasingly explore, because, of course, as Dennis said, I'm primarily a historian of astronomy, but I'm also fascinated by the history of medicine, and interested too, of course, needless to say, in the relationship between the Christian faith and science. This body of men I'm coming to be interested in more and more are what I call parson physicians, and in a way relates to Willis's early career, who of course was not a parson, but could easily have become one. It's the kind of approach of how you understand illness, if you're a clergyman, and how you practice medicine. Because it was possible in the 16th, 17th, up to really 1858, the Medical Registration Act, for an Oxford or Cambridge MA, trained in the classics, fluent in Greek and Latin, able to go and buy Hippocrates or Galen or Celsus or whoever it was, read them, and start physicking his parishioners. This was widespread. And the more I've looked into this area, the more of them there were. The astonishing thing is they were often very, very good. And as, of course, there was no concept of medical specialization in the 17th century, for instance, Willis would have treated a case of mania, or he would have treated an ulcer, or a broken leg, or anything like that. Although you have no particular specialism, if you were a country clergyman, or even an urban clergyman, and you had the folk coming to you, including the mentally ill, you would take them on board. Now, one man we must bear in mind was immensely significant here is Robert Burton, the anatomist, Anatomy of Melancholy fame, 1621. Burton was a clergyman of the Church of England. He was a chaplain and student of Christ Church, Oxford, who wrote, of course, one of the most influential books on depression ever written. It is a rambling, discursive work. And another thing, too, which harks into it is this mixture I've mentioned about classicism and Christianity, even going right back through the Christian centuries to the 1st century. He has no problems about talking about pagan deities or the virtue of this or that pagan god. At the same time that as a clergyman, he is talking about how to look at melancholy from a prospective view as a Christian and also too as a physician in the movement of black bile, the ubiquitous black bile. So he's one case. Now, we know that Burton was an avid amateur doctor. When he died, or sadly committed suicide, and I've never quite got to the basis of how, as a suicide, he was actually buried in Christ Church Cathedral, and I've discussed this with the current Dean, Christopher, and also with the presenter, John Payton. We can never quite get how he's buried there with a fine memorial as well. In fact, I may say that John Aubrey mentions the death of Burton with a charming obscureness. He became suspended. He became suspended. Quite how is not pointed out. Clearly a rope round his neck. But anyway, the central thing is his writings have a tremendous impact, and he practiced medicine in Oxford. We know this, that following his death, when his will was proved, he leaves most of his English physic books to a lady who was the wife of one of the canons of Christ Church. Again, of course, not uncommonly, not only clergy, but clergy wives would also practice medicine in their various places. We're told he had a large library, including a large medical library. So you could therefore take Burton as a sort of proto-early, well-documented, famous version of a proto-physician parson. I found another one too, who also took on mental cases. Another Oxford figure. I do apologise for having such an Oxford bias, but this is where I found most of my material. A man called John Ward, the Reverend John Ward. John Ward, in the Restoration, becomes Vicar of Stratford-upon-Avon, and very, very well documented. On the other hand, he used to spend long periods of time in Oxford or in London, just chumming around with his scientific friends. He knew Boyle, he knew Hooke, he knew Wilkins, he knew all of these people, he knew Willis, all of these people. And in his own casebooks, the originals of which now survive in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, but microphones of which are present in Oxford, you find this extraordinary body of cases. For instance, he would do this. He would come over to Oxford for, let's say, a fortnight, on his horse, presumably from Stratford. He normally stayed with a man called Stephen Toone, who was one of the city's manufacturing apothecary chemists. Toone used to do you teaching in chemistry and anatomy on the side if you were one of his lodgers. Can you imagine it that way? You go into a B&B and you have lectures on chemistry and anatomy thrown in, like the first one in the B&B. Toone did this, quite clearly. He then had a number of medical pals he used to visit house cases with. He also, of course, was interested in chemistry and mentions a case of one person who had died with a large amount of water in their head and neck and body, clearly sort of dropsy case, and he says that they removed 3 bucketfuls of water from this person, and then what did they think? Let's distill it. So they put it in a still and boil it away, and he says it turned to a thick, mucilage or sludge, and only 3 or 4 spoonfuls of water dripped out of the end of the retort. Isn't that wonderful? That's just showing you what they're doing. He mentions visiting with his medical pals in Oxford and friends at St Bartholomew's in London cases of hydrocephalus. What actually is in the head of a hydrocephalus person? Dissect one if you can get hold of it. He mentions behavioural abnormalities, what we would have called, of course, depressive and also raging mania cases. All of this is present in him. Yet, in fact, Ward is a clergyman. And how is his work preserved now in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington? Quite simply, he buried Susanna Shakespeare in 1668. And the Folgers themselves, the great Shakespeare collectors, bought virtually anything connecting with the family. And when, of course, his diaries came onto the market of the 1920s, the Folgers grabbed them up, and hence, of course, they're now preserved in Washington. But he's another excellent case. I could go on far, far more about Ward. He's a massively influential figure, played an important role in the founding of the early Museum of the History of Science, as it became, and the laboratory there. But then, when you get into the 18th century, you find quite a number more. Now, John Wesley, we have to bear in mind, had serious, sustained medical interests. And if you look at that classic primitive physic, 1747, and you look under words like lunatic, raging mania, nervous disorders, and things of this sort, that he actually addresses in this little book, about a quarter of an inch, half an inch thick, a wide variety of states of the mind. Now, Wesley is often dismissed. A lot of medical historians laugh at Wesley. Oh, look at this silly mixture of stuff. Say, take this stuff and rub it in and all the rest of it. This is quackery. What John Wesley is talking about in primitive physics is no worse than you would get prescribed by a Cambridge or an Oxford doctor of medicine for the same cases. In fact, he has 2 men. He often cites, if you read Wesley's footnotes, and there's quite a lot of them, he actually gives you the sources for the people he takes a lot of his cures from. One of them was George Cheney, an eminent late 17th, early 18th century physician, and also to the other one, Cambridge's very own Dr. Richard Mead, personal physician to Sir Isaac Newton, no less. Wesley cites Mead and Cheney all over the place, along with Hippocrates and a variety of others. Wesley falls perfectly into the category of physician, clergyman with a classical education behind him. And I often wonder, and this comes through to some degree in Wesley's diaries, that he will go somewhere to preach and he will have people who are ill. Now, of course, he's not remotely claiming any kind of miraculous touch, it's not that. But he might recommend them to take something. And, of course, primitive physic goes through a colossal number of editions. The Bodleian, if I remember correctly, in its first 100 years in print, has no less than 32 surviving editions of primitive physic. That's not including editions printed in the United States in the 1760s, 1670s onwards. But what does he say particularly about dealing with the mad, as it was often generically called? Well, he recognises, Wesley, the difference between the nervous disorder and the mania or loss of lucidity disorder. He says, for instance, that it's quite wrong to take the mad, as they were broadly called, and subject them to barbarous punishments. This, of course, was not uncommon. And he says, whilst one should always shave the head of the mad, the purpose of this is to let out heat. This is standard clinical practice of the day. If you have a thick head of hair, your brain got hotter than if you were totally bald. On the other hand, Wesley disagrees with scarifying the head. This was a common medical technique. Scarification, you would take a number of little cupping glasses, you put several little cuts in the scalp, you would take a warm glass, about the size of an egg cup, put it on. Of course, as the glass cooled, it would suck blood into it, and to somebody even hang on, then, a bit like a leech, pull it off. You were taking excess blood from the brain. Wesley disagrees with this procedure. He thinks it's fatuous. He thinks the best way, though, is to try to cool the brain, not by removing blood, but by actually putting cold things on it. And he actually describes that one excellent way to deal with a person in a state of raging mania is to pour a succession of tea kettles of cold water upon their shaved head. He actually puts a note, this invariably works. But what I'm saying all this about with Wesley, he's actually dealing with good clinical stuff for the day. And we misunderstand him completely if we write him off as a colourful 18th century amateur. Because as an amateur doctor clergyman, he was one of a great and noble breed, generated by both the universities, spread across the length and breadth of the British Isles. Wesley also too is a great recommender of electrification for especially the nervous. Now by nervous disorders, he would have been dealing with things which I suppose were a person who was generally sad or very, very imprecise terminology, but early electrical machines, already developed by people like Francis Hawksby in the early 18th century, whereby you would have had a large glass ball, spun it by means of a gearing mechanism, took off an electrical charge, and usually with chains, with brass chains, touched the person in a number of places. The general idea being that people who were nervous and lethargic needed stimulus. Electricity would provide stimulus. Of course, they're dealing with weak charges by modern standards. But the key thing I'm concerned with is the pathology that Wesley is working on. This is not old wives' tale stuff. This is taken from Ben Franklin, it's taken from Francis Hawksby, it's taken from Richard Mead, the very top scientists of his day. Now, when you bear in mind Wesley's influence as a Christian evangelist, you imagine that that is also linked in with the authorship of the best-selling, most widely read popular medical book of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And you get some idea there of where Wesley's clinical ideas soak into a population on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, what you start to find when looking at this whole parson tradition is, of course, the obvious one is the opening and the holding of madhouses, as they generically call them. The Reverend Morley Unwin of Huntingdonshire took in a number of mentally ill people in the middle years of the 18th century. His most famous patient was, of course, the poet Thomas Cooper, the author of the Olney Hymns. In fact, what you find with Unwin is the kind of gentleman who will have a large rectory and maybe as a way of supplementing his income, but also out of Christian duty. If he's interested particularly in mental conditions, he will take on a number of mad boarders. And we find that this is a very widespread feature. The most famous of these, of course, is the other Willis, not Thomas, but a century later, and unrelated, Dr. Francis, the Reverend Dr. Francis. Francis Willis was an Oxonian, Brasenose College originally, and became a Lincolnshire parson, who found that it was in the wilds of rural Lincolnshire in those days, medical help was thin on the ground, and as a good educated man, he had a nice going little practice in actually physicking parishioners. But he also had something particularly to it, and this almost resonates later on through what we would think of as hypnotism. He was famous for what he was called as the eye. He could look at you, and somehow even the maddest of the mad was somehow controlled, a kind of strange personal charisma with which he actually had this capacity. He treated several European crowned heads. He actually took a lease on a property in Lincolnshire, and there took in some cases as many as 14 or 15 people, usually of course gentlefolks who could afford to pay, and where he pioneered such things as what we would now call occupational therapy, digging the fields, working in the gardens, and not just sitting thinking about yourself all day long, but get out there and do something. To all of these 18th century people, qualified and clerical lay, madness was seen as rooted in one of its key areas in excessive introspection. Tradition, of course, the scholar's disease. What you've got to do, therefore, is something which is often called moral management. You've got to get them out of themselves in a gentle, caring, knowing way. We know that, of course, you would normally dine with your patients. You imagine that nowadays in a mental institution where you would sit down in an evening with 5 or 6 perhaps seriously disturbed people around your dinner table. One of the things I think we often forget to in that society, especially if you were dealing with the genteel mad, is you had codes of conduct that even and also religious beliefs shared in common that penetrated that society. So you may know, as in the case of William Cooper, that you were a gentleman, barrister, man of learning and culture, and you were also mad. But this very kind gentleman took you in and was doing what he could to help you. So you didn't throw a wobbly at dinner, you didn't throw your dinner against the wall, you bowed when you left table, and how far those codes of conduct actually were deeply therapeutic. Francis Willis is a master of this technique, combined with the eye. His famous patient, of course, was King George III, because Queen Charlotte brought in Willis to look at the king in 1788, when the king showed his first onset of serious disturbance, having been already by that time 28 years on the throne with no serious mental problems. Now, of course, modern theorists suggest it could have been porphyria that the king had. We know this from other clinical evidences. But what's so significant is that I think one could say that Willis did a colossal amount for the improvement of the status of medical care for the mentally ill. After all, if the head of the British Empire has lost his senses, precipitates a constitutional crisis, because his highly unpopular Prince of Wales was now badgering Parliament through Charles James Fox to have the monarchy effectively put into his hands, Willis holds an incredibly pivotal position. Willis is in a position where he is literally a kingmaker. He says from experience, I can cure His Majesty. Now, whether, of course, this was correct in clinical terms or not with porphyria, we don't know. He was confident he could do it. He said, give me a case within 3 months of the onset of the disease, and I will normally give you a cure. I don't think any modern psychiatrist would ever dare say that. That's the eye and a variety of other things. But the king did pull around through a mixture of moral management and also to an extraordinary exploration by Willis of how a relationship might develop. We're told that at the very beginning of their first interview, when the king was seriously mentally disturbed, and Willis came in, of course, dressed in clerical black, he was asked by the king what was his profession. And, of course, he explains to the king what he was doing. He says, sir, you have abandoned or not fully occupied a position or a profession which I profoundly admire for one I despise. In other words, not being a full-time clergyman, but being a mad doctor. Then it said that Willis says to the king, I, your majesty, but our saviour himself did cure the lunatic. Very, very nice report, to which, of course, the king responds, I, sir, but he did not get 700 a year for doing so. Where exactly George's state of mind was, at a quick speed of wit. And, of course, what Willis does over time, over the dark winter of 1688 into 1689, and constitutionally very significant because the king is getting back functional on the throne as the French Revolution is breaking out. So that's another crucial constitutional time that this is happening. And what you're finding with him is that he will then start reading Shakespeare with the king. Both Willis and Shakespeare, and the king loved Shakespeare. Then he undertakes the extraordinarily dangerous thing of letting the king shave himself. George apparently liked shaving himself. The idea of giving a sharp razor to a lunatic went against every rule of mad doctrine. But of course, Willis's personality, his built-up relationship with the king, and reminding His Majesty that as sovereign of Great Britain, you won't kill yourself or hurt yourself, will you, your Majesty? And so George shaves himself obediently, working even with the delusions to scatter the delusions. Now, Willis is probably the most spectacular of this whole breed of healers. Although you may say that, yes, Wesley was the longest standing of these. The one thing is, though, they're all working within the best clinical traditions of their day. There is nothing quackery about them. And one man I've just finished and published a short article about in Oxford called Edward Stone, who actually was the first person to suggest the use of willow bark for a prophylactic for what we now call aspirin. He is exactly of this tradition. The more I look for these medical clergymen in the 18th and the early 19th century, the more they pop up, literally like weeds in a garden. They were everywhere. Sidney Smith, the famous wit, comic writer, ultimately Canon of St. Paul's. He is the rector of Foston in the extreme north of Yorkshire, just at the beginning of the 19th century. A virulent epidemic breaks out in his parish. He applies to the Archbishop of York for a license to practice medicine in the diocese. And he wages war nobly and successfully. We're told that he was often giving people out bottles of physic. But waging war with an epidemic was only one thing he did. He treated rheumatism, madness, gout, all manner of things. And he treated rheumatism in a particularly ingenious way. He mentions bills for the making of tin hot water bottles of the shape of feet, legs, arms. So if you had a person with severe rheumatism, you could have one of these bottles fastened onto your leg or wherever, hot water poured in, and of course using the natural heat of the bottle. This is a man generally thought of as a clerical wit, not as a doctor, the Reverend Sidney Smith. Now, by the time you get into the early part of the 19th century, I think too, the evangelical revival as having a major way in which people think of the mad. Very obviously here, of course, are the Tukes of York. Not doctors, these are not clerical doctors, these are tea merchant doctors. William Tuke, a wealthy Quaker tea merchant of York, has the idea of taking in boarders, Quaker boarders, people who share his faith, his culture, his customs. And again, the York retreat rapidly becomes a byword for success. But of course, too, you have to bear in mind that this whole approach of evangelical Christianity to the study of the mentally ill, I think goes along with two other things as well. One is the abolition of the slave trade, and the other one is prison reform. All of these were major areas in which evangelical Christians were active, 1780, 1790, right into the 19th century. They all have one thing in common: whether you're a prisoner, a slave, or a madman, you are all being restrained against your will. And there's always the analogy of somehow Christ and the Gadarene swine, or the Gadarene lunatic, somehow liberate. Very, very powerful, of course, in the whole logic, theologically, of the evangelical revival, is liberating from bondage. Runs, of course, through Charles Wesley's hymns. My chains fell off, my heart was free, and things like that. I think this is one reason why they have such an incredible interest in the nature of the mentally ill, the slave, and the prisoner. And it forms an immensely humane environment. What starts to happen, though, outside the period, is you get what is often called by historians the medicalization of madness. This starts partly through the asylum movement, the bigger and growing asylum movement, and also, too, from attempts to study the pathology of the brain, especially in Vienna, where, of course, Freud himself was trained. When you start to look at the pathology of the brain, you have a whole school of figures. Henry Maudsley in London, inspirer of the Maudsley Mental Hospital, which is now attached to King's London. You also have Krafft Ebing in Germany. You have Francis Galton in England, Darwin's cousin. And you're now having a different explanation of what is mental illness. This explanation, first of all, is not Christian. It's not religious. It's biological reductionist. And not for nothing do people like Francis Galton claim inspiration from his cousin Charles Darwin, although he'd been working in these areas even before The Origin of Species was published. You start to have developed, by the 1850s, 60s, 70s, the idea of human degeneracy. That there are certain types of people, drunkards, prostitutes, idiots, people like that, whom you can do nothing for. Simply put them in a safe place. Even if possible, sterilize them so that reproduction does not become possible. And in this way, therefore, you start to see mental illness in all of its forms as not only a cruel biological trick, but a thing about which you can do nothing whatsoever, apart from remove them out of circulation. Now, this also too feeds into the eugenics movement. Eugenics movement of, do you remove not only from circulation, do you make biologically inactive? And of course, the eugenics movement spreads quite a lot in the 19th century, particularly in the United States, a country, of course, now perhaps where they're not quite as proud of it as they would have been 80 or 90 years ago. Certainly in Germany, very classically, of course, under the Third Reich. But we have to bear in mind that attempts to get eugenic legislation through the British Parliament fell consistently in the late 19th and early 20th century by that body of gentlemen, the bishops in the House of Lords. They would stop eugenic attempts to go through. Now, when you bear in mind what this is doing, is saying, no, mental illness in all of its forms is not degeneracy, it's not corruption or something like that. It's a thing that can be dealt with in a Christian context. And I think those men, no longer, of course, practicing medicine, the bishops in the House of Lords in the 1880s and 1890s, although perhaps their fathers had done in country rectories in the 1830s, what you've now got is the idea that you really still have this duty of care to the mentally ill. It's why I would argue, therefore, that the Christian approach to mental illness was a nobler one, a much more fruitful one than what you might call the post-1870, 1880 idea of, or what I often call with Freud, the mind as a shattered mirror. The best thing you can hope to do is keep the pieces held together with sticky tape, but it will never really work properly. I think a much nobler view is when you see at least the mentally ill as capable of full human status and full redeemed force. Recognise them too, not as defective people, but as people with souls, souls as good as everybody else's, but with sadly defective brains. And hence, of course, working around that as a way of giving them as much peace as you can in this world, even if you can't cure. I would suggest that perhaps the first persons or the first stuff to be a psychoactively effective material does not date from the 1960s, it dates from 1870, chloral hydrate. I supervised a thesis in Oxford some years ago by a woman called Anna Simmons, who's now a lecturer at the Open University, and she was working on the case books of the Warnford Hospital in Oxford. The Warnford Hospital was founded in 1829 by the Reverend Dr Samuel Warnford for sick, mentally ill people, particularly those who had families who could pay a guinea a week to keep them in the institution. In fact, Anna has found out most of the people who were Dr Warnford's patients originally were either curates or governesses. Both of them belonged to that sort of the edge of the gentry and somehow not quite knowing where their status was going to go. But in fact, also his institution had a good success rate. And Warnford's institution, where he was not physician, he actually had the Regius Professor of Medicine as the visiting physician of the house. The clergy, these are a very large number of clergymen amongst the patients, when they were getting better, would then be used in the chapel to help with the services, to do readings, or of course to celebrate the Eucharist. And again, it's like the Willis method of bringing in those and engaging people back into society to become fully functional. It's madness as seen as a curable blip in an otherwise natural state of grace in the mind. Now, what was the first substance, therefore, that you could use that would change the way in which people behaved? Well, Anna found, when working in the Warnford records, and also some of the Littlemore, which was the county asylum records of the same period, 1870 is a breaking point. Chloral hydrate, a new German mild narcotic. It was the answer to every mad doctor's prayer. It was not addictive, like opium, and it had a metabolic period of about 8 hours. You could give it in a cold or a warm drink, and the patient would go out like a light for the 8 hours of the night. You didn't need to have heavies around the hospital, as you did before. Patients slept better because there wasn't shrieking and banging, which was tragically, even to this day, sometimes happens on the wards of mental institutions. And in fact, Anna found an elderly male nurse who had been working at the Warnford in the 1950s. And he said, oh yes, we used to go around with it every night on a trolley, a glass of orange juice for each patient with the appropriate couple of spoonfuls of chloral hydrate stored in. Now this, I would say, is the first thing that changes asylum management, because it now actually makes the patient body at least capable of, well, 8 hours good sleep. Now, this is a rapid run through the subject. My approach, of course, is historical because I'm a historian, and I look naturally for historical connecting points. But I think it's important to realise that when we look now, at least especially in the Freudian period, which of course is not what it used to be, but also too in the time of, let's say, the early part of the 20th century when degenerative theories were still held in asylums, that the Christian approach was a much nobler one. It actually did not demean the individual. It always had hope implicit within the therapeutic package. And in spite of the fact that, yes, if you were a keeper of an asylum, let alone if you're one of the heavy men employed by the asylum, they must have driven you stark screaming mad. I'm quite aware of that. This I've discovered from psychiatrists, that, you know, to be in a place with 40 or 50 people who are seriously mentally disturbed could make you perhaps lash out at them with a whip or something like that. So one can understand that. But this is not therapy. This is the breaking of the keeper's temper. I think what the Christian approach says is that there is something there that is redeemable and capable of being put back into balance in being made workable once more. I think, fortunately, from what I know within the National Health Service now, no matter what individual beliefs may be, there are at least no attempts to work with the belief systems of the person, rather than working on the idea that somehow religious belief is part of the demented process. But I hope this afternoon to have, in this rapid scamper through the subject, to have opened it up for you, and I'd be glad to take any questions.
So let's go right into our time of questions. So who would like to ask the first question?
It's
Yes,
interesting
David.
how
Yes.
the nature of so-called mental disease has changed from being physical, you know, circulations of the cerebrospinal fluid, to being mental, requiring some sort of mental treatment, and now it's swinging back to being much more physical again these days with modern antipsychotic drugs and electroconvulsive therapy and things like that.
And of course, too, going back to electroconvulsive therapy, Wesley using his electrical machine for the nervous, yes. But it is fascinating. But I think it tends to go in cycles. You know, a lot of things in medicine come in cycles, like what things are. I suppose because mental illness is the most elusive of all illnesses. We just cannot pin it down, let's say, cardiovascular disorders or something like that. It probably has generated, as new evidences have come forward, changing theories.
Question? Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Yes.
It would be so easy to get into semantic difficulties over this, wouldn't it? But hearing you speak about the separation in the Christian idea of the soul from disorders of the mind or personality or whatever it is that is reasonably connected with lesions we can demonstrate in the brain, does that give you an understanding of the soul of a Thomist kind? That it's, would you like
It's a good point. I mean, I think now we are just as far from understanding what the nature of the soul is as Thomas Aquinas was, or Thomas Willis, or anybody like that. The thing I mean, it doesn't personally bother me that you can't find a pineal gland equivalent to find where it's lodged. What interests me is the behaviour of people and how the realisation of a soul, or at least the acknowledging that a person has one, is often itself therapeutically beneficial. Now, of course, I'm not speaking there as a clinician. I'm not a clinician. But with people, I mean, for instance, I can give you a case of a lady I knew very, very well. She was a relative of my wife's, who died in 2002 of cancer in her 40s, graduate of this university, read classics at Newnham, like My wife Rachel went to Oxford, her sisters went to Newnham, so there's always been that thing there. And had a brilliant legal career, and then at 27 had a major breakdown. And for the next nearly 20 years of her life was in and out of mental hospitals. She was a devout Christian. She said regularly that she could fully understand talk of possession, that something was dragging her when these incidents came on, dragging her where she didn't want to go, and she'd fight them and resist them. But they'd normally, of course, clearly they were biologically related. But she had a very clear sense of the soul and of the immortality of the soul. She knew, of course, her classical authors very, very well. And I found talking to her, a lady called Miranda Woodrow, how our ideas moved on this. And the idea that, yes, we don't know what a soul is, we can pin down functional structures to particular lesions, as Willis, of course, fully knew, but somehow it's when the whole thing comes together. There's what you might call a bigger cognition. But I can go no nearer than that, and I suspect nobody else can.
Okay. Yes.
Since I've got a chance to put a question, I didn't expect you're in the way of the camera now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm slightly deaf, so that's why I'm sorry.
Okay,
I do apologise, yes.
Because as towards the end, you veered towards the use of substances, medicines and that, and it's a particular subject of mine. Apart from this flood of Darwinism we've had on the television and in the lecture halls, there have been in the last 2 days 2 programmes about ayahuasca as used in South America, and the so-called spirit molecule DMT first was legal for research in America and now for religious purposes. I hope you would approve the possibility that we here might also benefit from this type of experience, which is such a healing and transcendent thing. Do you think that you could...
I have no problem with the idea that the human body and the state of soul or mind responds to chemical substances. After all, I think it's Psalm 15, wine gladdeneth the heart of man. The realization, of course, that chemical substances, even in David's time, could somehow change your understanding. So I've no problem with the idea that the functional lesions of the brain respond to many things, alcohol over the centuries. And that is, of course, many, many complicated substances, mescaline and with Aldous Huxley and things like that. That doesn't cause me a problem at all, because I fully accept, of course, that our working bodies are mechanical and physical, in the same way that Thomas Hobbes describes in the 17th century. But somehow or other, the life of the mind, the cognitive process, whatever you want to call it, seems a meta, to me, a meta state that somehow is bigger than the physiology. Although, yes, when the physiology breaks down, it goes off somewhere else. I can fully see that. But it's that golden cord linking the cognitive, what you might call a higher self, to the meat that has fascinated neurologists, mad doctors, people like that from the days of Hippocrates down to today. But I don't think we're any nearer.
I wonder if I could ask a question. Yes, just I just wondering.
I didn't see that programme, by the way, so I can't comment on the programme. So yeah.
This transition from the kind of clerics who took people into their homes and they had a kind of boarding house, as it were, for the mentally ill, and the transition to the more established early mental hospitals, like I mentioned, the Maudsley and so on. So, was there a connection between those two? Were they entirely separate historically, or was there a flow from one to the other? Could you just fill in that gap? There's a gap there somewhere. Yes,
I'd say in terms of the proper asylums, as opposed to merely dumping grounds for the mentally ill, the Tukes are pivotal in York. The retreat in York is a model. People from America, Europe, go and visit it. It's an ideal way to treat at least co-religionists. That's at least one way to it. You then find in the early part of the 19th century the founding of a number of county asylums, partly because there is a big population increase between about 1790 and about 1840, and because, needless to say, when you have more people, you will have more mental illness. You also have colossal social dislocation, the Napoleonic Wars, endemic poverty, industrial difficulties. So you can see how many things happen there. So there's a feeling that you need somewhere to put all sorts of people. And that, I think, starts coming out of the race. You do get model figures, such as John Connolly of the Hanwell Institution in Essex, where I think it was in total about 5,000 people. These were all what they called pauper lunatics, because of course they were there from the parishes. He brought in such innovations as bringing in the local militia band to play for them, holding dances, and recognise, of course, that this kindness therapy, in a mass basis, this may have happened at somewhere like, let's say, the York Retreat, or we know too it happened at the Warnford in Oxford. But now this is for 5,000 paupers. This is not for 25 slightly distracted curates. It's a different kind of approach. And it moves into an almost industrialized institutional basis by the 1860s, 1870s. It then fits in with things like how you classify mental types. Francis Galton, for instance, believes that you can have composite photography, a rather fascinating technique. You take, well, any known distinct mental type, thug, naval officer, swindler, whatever it is, and you have them in some place of keeping, a jail or an officer's mess or somewhere like that, and you have 10 of them, and you photograph each one, and on the glass plate of the camera, you line up the eyes, the nose, and the mouth to a particular plate, and if you've got 10 to photograph, you give each one a 10th of a correct exposure. And then you develop the plate, and you have one face, they thought, coming out of this. This is the Broadmoor thug. This is the carrier of the Queen's Commission. This is a pickpocket from Whitechapel. And the attempt to even use the asylums as sort of laboratories of classifying mental disorders, and particularly when this was seen in a degenerative sense, such as particular violent types or people like that, murderers. Most asylums were photographing their inmates by 1880, something like that. Partly, of course, to tag them, but partly too, of course, to actually pin them down into some kind of therapeutic process. The shaving of the head, another one too, a common thing, carries on for a long, long time, the shaving of the head of the mad, as well as prisoners. And of course you see Galton's photographs of Dartmoor prisoners and the completely shaved headed. And you think sometimes, a real sort of a heavy from the East End in Broadmoor does look a little bit different from, let's say, a Cambridge clergyman in terms of the general shape of the face and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, of course, as selection goes on, I wonder how far he picked. He's a classic nasty piece of work. Let's get 9 more like him and expose a plate. So I think that goes on. But the central thing is they were trying to find a physical basis. And if you couldn't find one inside the head, you often tried to do it in the face and the general body shape.
Thank you very much, Dean. Well, we worked him very hard. He spent more than 4 hours getting here from Oxford, and we hope that his trip back to Oxford will be a little easier than the one
It's a great pleasure to come there.
But thank you very much indeed, Alan, again. Yes.